It's only entertainment.
Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, capital markets analyst and host of your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today, we've got Milan Patel. He is the CEO, co-founder of Pathogen DX. Milan, thanks for being with us at the Talking Hedge.
Thank you for having us, Josh. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of interesting. I've worked on some projects with National Institute of Health. Looks like that's going to be one of your partners as well. Tell the audience a little bit about what you do, because they understand pesticide testing to an extent, and that's about it. So you're doing a lot more than that. Tell the audience a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So our company, Pathogen DX, is a platform diagnostics company. So what does that mean? That means that we design, develop, manufacture, and sell testing kits and equipment to testing labs. And the three markets we are prevalent in, or at least have some footprint in, is basically largely in the cannabis market, in the food and environmental market, and most recently, because of COVID, in the clinical market.
Mm-hmm. And with the cannabis specifically, what is it about the need for that? I know that with hemp, there's a lot of issues with some of the heavy metal uptake from hemp, and you definitely don't want that crossing the blood-brain barrier. So getting it tested for obvious reasons, just so you don't want all that, whether it's pesticides or other bacteria. There's a lot of things that can happen within that kind of growth cycle from people touching it or whatever else. So tell us a little bit about like cannabis specifically and some of the testing that you're providing and how maybe that's helping some of the new emerging markets.
Yep, absolutely. Great question. So the technology in the cannabis market, specifically in the industry itself, there's a prevalence of a lot of bacteria and a lot of fungal organisms. By virtue, in a lot of the grows, you have to deal with E. coli, salmonella. These are the known castor characters we've all dealt with, whether it's the romaine lettuce or chipotle, which we've heard about, and also from a soil perspective, you've got these very pathogenic species on the fungal side, Aspergillus flavus, fumigatus, niger, and terreus. And then you have Staph aureus, Clostridium, you've got Mucor. So there's a host of anywhere from 6 bugs that are sort of deadly, to at least about a couple of dozen, maybe even up to 50 if you're looking for plant pathogens that have to do with the health of the plant itself, the crop itself. And so a lot of the states in the cannabis sector have promulgated laws, testing regulations around testing of these bacteria and funguses, pathogens specifically, that could be deadly to immunocompromised consumers and patients, those that are cancer patients that may have immune suppressed systems. And so the bottom line is you're having to test whether it's flower material or non-flower matrices, whether it's tinctures, concentrates, and edibles for these types of bugs. And what our technology sort of does is it really simply tests it instead of one at a time, like an individual petri dish at a time, moving back to the 19th century to Julius Petri. We multiplex, meaning you actually test for all those particular pathogens in a single test, very efficiently, very simply, in a very cost-reduced manner. So the whole idea here is to move the industry and the world into not using a 19th century enrichment-based approach that where the methods are so outdated relative to the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, there's a lot of 19th century technology everyone's still using, like the high pressure sodium and metal halide bulbs that were used in 19th century street lights. So maybe they'll come up to speed with a lot of these things. I'm curious though, how much needs to be tested though? Because right now Washington State is looking at adding pesticide testing, which they should have, and they don't. But what they're trying to do is decide whether it's going to be every 5-pound lot or 50-pound lot. Do you have any advice or recommendations on how much people should be testing in order to do it efficiently?
I think in the case of what we deal with in terms of bacterial and fungal organisms, I think when you pick a 50-pound lot, that's too big of a batch size, because bacteria and fungus they don't grow uniformly over us putting, a netted Christmas tree light over a hedge, and you see the lights uniformly distributed as if they were an analogy of a bug. You see them growing in concentrated in different parts. So if you pick one side of a batch on such a large batch, it's going to have nothing. In a place, it might have a concentrated cluster of pathogens. So I think that, the 5 to 10 pound batch is more reasonable. On the top end, it would be 20. But I think what we've seen a lot of prevalence of Aspergillus as up to 20 to 30%. And even E. coli and Salmonella and other organisms. When you look at this market and you look at it at the state level, in states like Washington, they're very light on the regulation for microbials. So the country's looking more like these 7 cast of characters: Salmonella, E. coli, pathogenic STEC 1, STEC 2, and the 4 Aspergillus species. That's what it's sort of looking like. But now, in the case of New York, they've got 15 pathogens, because their state health lab went in and they said, where have we seen specific cases, clinical cases, where you and I got sick because of one differentiated bug, one unique bug? And that what it is a function of clinical cases where somebody fundamentally got sick. So in that particular case, it could look like as many as 15. And so the idea is that, how do you make it simple? Well, you use our kind of innovative technology, which really flattens the cost, reduces the turnaround time, and you get the answer very efficiently. Because over the course of time, Josh, you only add more bugs. You only add more regulation as we get more federalization. We're not going to add less. And if you look at the food industry, every week there's an outbreak, every week. So when we grow to the size of the food industry, are we looking at 2,000 recalls nationally? Because we didn't really solve the problem. So that's really the driving force of why we need to, have a good balance between state regulations that are too light and federal regulations that are up here. Because when we come into federalization, we're either going to crash into that wall, or we're going to naturally, transition into that federal framework.
How do you merge the two from boots on the ground standpoint of too much regulation costing too much money? So by moving from the 5-pound bag to a 50-pound bag, you're saying that it's not going to be efficient, but it's more cost effective. So all these farmers that have razor thin margins are complaining about the additional regulatory burdens, and yet it's essential in order to test for all of these issues: E. coli, Salmonella, powdery mildew, mold, fungus, all this stuff. So I guess I'm gonna ask you in a different or the same way, and maybe you can give me a different answer. What is your opinion on how to effectively offer a solution that's both cost effective and efficient?
I think the idea is truly technological innovation. And what I mean by that is, we can continue doing, what's the definition of insanity? You continue to do the same thing over and over again. So like I said, if we continue to reuse yesteryear's century-old practices for modern day challenges with pathogens, you're not really applying that. So in the case of, look at the level of innovation we saw out of COVID testing era in the last 2 years. We leapfrogged the way viral pathogen testing was done clinically and diagnostically, just from the amount of focus and effort. So what I'm saying is, I want to think about it from the standpoint, if every lab in this country had to grow 7 petri dishes for every sample that they've collected from every grower, and it takes you 3 to 5 days, forget it. It's game over. And the grower will say, the farmer will say, hey, guess what? This is taking too long. Okay, this is too costly. And oh, by the way, by the time you get the answer, their outbreaks spread across their whole cultivation.
Right.
Now, that innovation that we apply with the ability to multiplex, meaning the ability to test for all these in a single test in less than 6 hours, is the ability to flatten that, is the leapfrog on innovation to reduce that cost. And that cost isn't stratospheric. It's actually equivalent, if not less, when you factor in the total cost of Petri dish testing and the time component, all together. So it is a function of that. And so I think that that's the key driving force. So people sometimes think that innovation is always more expensive than what they're doing today, when it really isn't. You see? So
I say the same thing to people who have 18 employees on a joint rolling table, and I'm like, just buy an automated machine. What are you doing, folks? I'm curious about the mold to gold, and if that's mitigating risk. A lot of folks that are skeptical about testing, or they don't want to have to throw their crop away, are just going to go and take moldy product and blast it into concentrate. Is that enough though? Are you really getting rid of all of that? Is it truly mitigating your risk?
Look, I'm a purist, right? But that is being idealistic, right? I love your question, because the first thing when you raised your question, Josh, the visual that came up in my mind is, Josh, are you going to, if you come to my house, I'm going to give you moldy bread. Are you going to consume that moldy bread? But somebody will say, no, well, it's basically pressurized and we've gotten rid of it. Will you eat it? Will you give it to your grandma? You're not, right? Because the bottom line is, somebody will say, is it truly pure even after you go through the extraction process? I don't know if it is. It's an oil, but I don't know the long-term consequences from our health outcomes perspective, what that does, right? So 30, 40 years from now, we may find out that it didn't really do anything, it was beneficial. Or 30 years from now, we may find out that it may have very impactful, or it may be impactful from our health outcomes. And what I'm saying is, when you're young and you're consuming it, your immune system's super healthy. It's like a new tire with new tread. But when you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that tread wears away, and your immune system is more susceptible to a longer term consumption of this type of compromise, and it can be a compromised product. I don't know they call it longitudinal testing, meaning over the long course of time, do we know whether clinically this is going to be beneficial or harmful? And that's where we don't know. So I can't say that it's a bad thing, but what I can say is that if we address the mold right from the starting point, and how we do that is, one of our products is EnviroX. It tests for the spores in a grow, like what's floating in the air in the cultivation facility, and it can test if there's actually microbes that are landing on the canopy that create that yeast and mold. We test on surfaces and we test on the water. So if we test for those locations, and it sounds, bless you, it sounds basically expensive, but it's not. If we clean the house we're growing our product in, and we sanitize it, then there's less incidence of our crop being moldy. And when our crop is not moldy and it's more pure, then we're not having to treat it in the back end of the process. And that's my fundamental belief, that we as an industry should be going in that direction, primarily because when the FDA finally shows up in this conversation that you and I are having, and let's just say there's a third person and he's an FDA regulator, he's going to be pointing a finger like this. And that finger is going to say, guess what? I believe in what is called CGMP, continuous good manufacturing practices. What that means is, you, Mr. Grower, will have to test your soil, your water, your air, and your supply chain to make sure if it's going to be graded as medically grade product, medically grade marijuana, that it right from the get-go, from the time where you got that soil, is absolutely devoid of any kind of contamination or influence on compromising the product quality. So there's a lot of things I threw there, but part of it is us sort of having that mindset that let's focus on the things where the source of this contamination occurs on the plant and address those first, rather than sort of back end saying, let's just, send it down the extraction pathway.
Mm-hmm. Are you finding that states and government agencies are on board? I myself have worked on another project where it was basically electrolyzed saline. It's hypochlorous acid with the charge. That would have worked really well. The Washington state regulators, the Liquor and Cannabis Board, liked the idea, would have saved them $2 billion when we had swine flu, but they're kind of restricted on what they can do without FDA. So trying to go through that route was like $2 million to get approval, just to have something that everybody knows about, to try to get more natural products. I think glyphosate is in everything from Cheerios to wine. And I think reducing the amount of pesticides and everything we need is better for everybody involved, especially when we talk about medical marijuana. There's a new hemp blight that's out. I forget what it's called. There's something that's going on with that. Do you know anything about what's going on and how that could affect the market?
There's definitely there's a bunch of viruses that are out there. Latent hop virus, this cucumber mosaic virus. So there is this outbreaks of these viruses across multiple grows that have been there for the last year and a half, and it's having devastating impact. It's not something you can just culture or plate culture with. So your question around is, do we see the tide turning? Yeah, we do. In fact, I think that we're going in, I call it phase 2 or 3 of our industry from a regulatory perspective. There's a normalization of this at the state level, but I still think that we are not really focused on really thinking about the mindset of the federal government. Mm-hmm. If this was FDA and USDA, we have to sort of say, would they change anything about the federal regulatory framework for cannabis or marijuana? Absolutely not. Think about it. They're going to apply the pharmaceutical regulatory framework basically because it's a lot easier to do with what they've got rather than saying, let's come up with something brand new. No, they're not. So they're going to treat us the same way. So part of it is that step by step, we have to work, we have to get up on our 2 feet. We have to baby step towards that federal framework. And I think we have to adopt some aspects of it in our mindset and our operational practices. And that'll get better. But I think at the end of the day, I can see us turning the corner, but we're not completely turning the corner, because as the regulators are turning the corner, they're being tugged by the growers to a large degree, Josh, to sort of say, guess what? We don't want too much of our testing. Mm-hmm. Well, you're not going to have an option when tomorrow we're all at the doorstep of the FDA, and those growers are out of business, period. That's it.
Is there a preventative way to find out if there is, not the things we were talking about, not the E. coli or salmonella, powdery mildew or mold, but I don't want to say more serious, but the issues that cause blight, the things that are going on with the viruses in hemp. Is there a way to test for those in a preventative manner?
Yes, it is. It's the same thing that if you tested the actual product, you can capture it in the environment before it winds up on the product, like I said, in the air. And so we've got a really cool device. It's called a Coriolis unit. It's like a Dyson vacuum cleaner with a gooseneck, and it's got a valve on it, so it sucks in like 300 cubic meters of air in a grow. So if there's a flow stream going in the cultivation facility, it'll be able to capture that in viable form, meaning in living form. And we test that using the same technology we've got. So you'll know that it's out there before it sort of hits the canopy. And then it just, erratically spreads across the canopy. You can actually isolate it, and then you'll be able to know where that source is coming from. So we have now the technology to do that, even if it's surface borne or if it's water borne, such as Legionella and stuff like that. But the blights, yeah, absolutely. And so we've got this new product called PhytoX, which is all of these viruses that are now plaguing the industry, both hemp and cannabis, that we're going to release in the next couple of quarters, that'll do the same testing at a very simple level so that it can help the farmers and the cultivators environmentally, right? And that'll mitigate the areas that they've already got contamination because of the blight, and they can cordon it off, right, at the end of the day, so it doesn't spread. So it reduces it prevents a financial burden on them, reduces the amount of financial burden on them, because they can't catch it fast enough.
I'm curious where the adoption rate is happening faster. When I think of medical marijuana, I think of like Colombia and Peru, places that actually have like MDs, doctors prescribing cannabis in a medical facility. And right now in the US, we kind of have this older market on the West versus kind of a new emerging market on the East. Do you find that there's a difference in adoption rates with testing right now in terms of who's calling you and inquiring? Is it kind of the new markets that are looking for an exit strategy with federal legalization rather than the older markets that are like, we're barely holding on, we're just hoping to survive till tomorrow? What has been your take with the older markets versus the new emerging markets?
I think the older markets, basically food and agricultural, food and specifically, is very conservative. They're not adopt to change. And the reason is because at the federal level, it's very punitive. If you fraudulently or falsely change results in a lab or at a manufacturer, you go to jail, because that's the implication at the federal level. Like what happened with Listeria contamination in Blue Bell ice cream. So it's so punitive that they've corrected the behavior, but it's so the pendulum swung so too far to the right that it's hard to bring innovation in, to the degree that we can in the cannabis sector. In the agricultural sector, they've been burned, and this is a function and consequence of hemp itself. But in the agricultural sector, because of the number of blights that they've had on wheat, on corn, on maize, that the farmers over decades have the practices to ensure that from just an industry practice, they don't even need regulations. They've been burnt so much time and time again over the number of different times that they've had famines and they've blights, that it's a practice for them to test. Okay, and yes, it's costly, but at the end of the day, it's a given cost. Now in the cannabis sector, it's a different world, and that's because we are seeking approval, we're seeking credibility, we're seeking acceptance that Big Brother, the federal engine, will accept us as a credible industry doing the right thing. So when you look at East Coast to West Coast basically at the end of the day are still going through that state level ballot of setting regulations. When you look at New Jersey, all of those states, they're still sort of starting to sprout up. If you may, West Coast is sort of a little bit more further up that maturation curve and starting to look alike. And so it's building sort of not just an individual state level, but it's regional, and it's starting to look like the same approach. So it's good news overall. So, at the end of the day, that's how I see it. And I think the level of innovation in the cannabis sector was the number of turns in terms of innovation turns was unprecedented. It's mind-boggling, to tell you the truth, in 7 years, because cottage industry, you and I are willing to share things. We're not in it just for the quote unquote money and the IP, but I think that's also starting to change, you see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think a lot of people are changing from soil to hydroponics as well. I don't know if there's a Listeria season, but there is a fair season. And I hear about a lot of Listeria cases at fairs with the hot tubs and the misters when it's warm outside. Are you seeing an uptick in Listeria as a result of more people using hydroponics without cleaning out the lines? Obviously, you could test for that, but are you seeing an uptick in cases of Listeria and testing?
We're not in the cannabis sector because they don't mandate it, right? So if they mandated Listeria across these states, then we would probably see that as an uptick. But in the food side of the world, we see it. We see it a lot, right? And what's happening is when USDA comes in, they're going to say it's not just Listeria that's important, it's Listeria monocytogenes, a specific pathogenic subspecies of it. So, I think that at the end of the day, it's a function of what the states are promulgating in terms of testing regulations. But if they added it, we would probably see it, just like we're seeing aspergillus everywhere. You see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's going to be fire season eventually when the West Coast just starts burning. In Oregon, we saw a lot of mold being pushed through filtration systems and testing positive, even though there wasn't, quote unquote, mold that was growing on the plant. There was mold on the plant. I'm curious if you've seen that. There's obviously ways people should be testing for it, even if they aren't, even if the conditions don't say, that there's something wrong, there always could be something wrong. Curious about your take on that.
Yeah, we can still test for it, even if the thing about our method is it's a DNA method. So DNA doesn't lie. Okay, it's a signature. It's basically a digital signature of that of mold on there. It could be, all different kinds of mold. It could be mucor. It could be aspergillus. It could be Saccharomyces. These are different makeups of mold, yeast and mold. So it's not like it burns away and you're clear of consuming it. But if it's dead, it's dead, and that's the part of it. So the question is, the issue is when you have fire, you may have stressed the bug or the bugs, yeast and mold bugs, but they may not have died. They may have been living but non-viable, meaning it's still living, but it can't be cultured, meaning you can't grow it on a petri dish. So it would still be something that's being stressed. Those cells are stressed, but they're still living. So we can still test for it. And our method is both living and dead DNA, although we spin out the dead DNA from non-viable cells, meaning non-living cells. So we're only sort of testing only the living cells, which have real live DNA in it. And that's our approach. And so, it's unfortunate because we're starting to, what you're saying is now fire season's here, and we're going to start to see, carcinogenic based, product that's going to have it's going to have some kind of fumes on it, and then it's going to have some kind of, influence of the fire onto the actual product itself, and may have an impact on the mold itself.
Mm-hmm. What are some best practices? Any advice you have for people that they should, when they're looking at a grow? There's a lot of new grows that are going to be happening from New Jersey to New Mexico. What are some best practices to avoid a lot of this?
I think that if you're in the grow business, and they probably know the business better than me, but I think from an environmental perspective, I think that again, I'll go back to, if we don't clean the houses once a year, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to get mold, right? So what you want to do is, if we really want to solve this problem, and we don't play whack-a-mole where we're using hydrogen peroxide to spray over the canopy, or you're using UV light, or microwaving the product, or remediating the product, you want to get over a 365-day, and not every day you're testing, just even once a month, or if you can do it quarterly, really the hot zones in terms of airflow, in terms of water flow, in terms of traffic flow. And you can get a 3D spectral profile of what sort of reoccurs in the walls of your building, the vents of your building, the airflows. Where is the stream of pathogenic pathogenic sort of layering in there on the canopy? And that's the important piece, because you'll spend millions of dollars building this thing, but we'll walk over, let's just pick tens of thousands of dollars to do the environmental monitoring that would save them hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on that front. And what I think for those grows is making sure that they have the capability and the facilities to do that, so that they can then build the right grow facilities from an environmental perspective that mitigates all of those spores winding up on the finished product, you see.
Mm-hmm. We talked a lot today. Anything that we left out that you want to talk about?
Yeah, look, I mean, thank you for the time today. I think you covered spectrum of different topics, which I was really happy with these questions. the topic that I really, final thoughts is really around, it's the human nature in us to always dig our heels in to resist change, right? But I think that the industry's phenomenally come a long way, because of just the mass scale of it and the passion behind all of us as individuals, because we care enough. Whether we want to call it Prohibition 3.0 or not, it's a different thing. But what I'm impressed upon is that it's about the innovation. And I'm really passionate about the fact that, and I brought this up, we need the regulations to move to 21st century challenges we're having. Number two, we want mindset to be open to change, because it's really key, because we are at war with pathogens. We just felt we saw 6 million people die of a bug in the last 2 years, close to 1 million in the United States over one virus. So we are at war with pathogens. It's not going to ever go away. And if we continue to spray more antimicrobials, use more antibiotics on our food, our agricultural, our environmental systems, it's going to create more and more superbugs. And when it creates more and more superbugs, it's going to be more difficult, if we haven't moved along from an innovation perspective, to use technologies that prevent, adding more fuel to the fire, if you may, creating more challenges in the future for our not just us, but our kids' generations, for example. And so that's an important point that I want to, distinguish why I feel passionate about this. And so my biggest challenge right now is I've got a great technological company that innovates in a disruptive fashion, but I'm asking us all to be open-minded, where we use these new innovative technologies, and also ask us from a regulatory perspective to move that regulations to more of a balanced level, where it's between the state and the federal, so we can all have a win-win-win-win, right? Amongst the regulators, amongst the industry, amongst the technology providers, and finally, most importantly, amongst us as consumers and patients, whether it's cannabis, hemp, food, agriculture. We need to get there, because otherwise we don't have a sustainable model. And all we're doing is we're rinsing and repeating the same thing in cannabis to these other industries. And I'm sorry for getting on my soapbox, but that's really important for leaving it final thoughts. But I want to thank you, because you've been wonderful for these kinds of questions, and I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I appreciate the passion. That's why I wanted to ask. I'm a firm believer in Kaizen, Japanese philosophy of constant improvement for the better. When in a previous life, when I was at Bank of America, and they labeled me as a resistor because I resisted change, it wasn't change I was resisting. It was just really bad ideas I was resisting. So I'm proud to be labeled a resistor to Bank of America. I can't wait for DeFi to knock them into obscurity. But that's a podcast for another day. Milan, where are you guys at in social media? Where can people find you at?
We're on LinkedIn. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. Those three. You can just type in Pathogen DX and we'll pop up. And Justin will also forward them over. I'm not I should have all the handles ready to announce off to you.
You got a team to delegate that to, Milan. We're going to put the LinkedIn down in the show notes so that YouTube doesn't, get us in too much trouble with any other links. But I think with that, we're going to have to roll this one up. So I want to thank my guest, Milan Patel, CEO, co-founder of Pathogen DX. Milan, appreciate you being on the Talking Hedge.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for having me on Talking Hedge. Yeah. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you, man. Have a great weekend. But with that, I'm Josh Kincaid. This is the Talking Hedge. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't. And I'm out. Don't forget to smash that like button on your way out and check out these other videos that we've got.